In 1965, one of our most famous movie critics, Pauline Kael, wrote that The Sound of Music was the sugar-coated lie people seem to want to eat, and that audiences turn into emotional and aesthetic imbeciles when we hear ourselves humming the sickly, goody-goody songs. That is to say that The Sound of Music, like movies are today, have a disconnect between critics and the general audiences, something that is reflective in the Oscars history 60 years later, and something that was very true then. And that's what I want to talk about today, The Sound of Music 60 years later, because this is, I think, honestly, my first time watching this movie all the way through. I know for a fact I had seen this movie as a kid. This was one of my mother's favorite movies. This was one of my grandfather's favorite movies. So I definitely remember this movie being on in the house. To be honest, I couldn't tell you a lot of the plot beats within The Sound of Music. This was really my first time watching it with eyes wide open, being / having an adult perspective in this movie. And I'm really glad that I did, because I had some preconceived notions about this movie directed by Robert Wise, who also brought us West Side Story, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and surprisingly enough, Star Trek, the motion picture. This is a guy who was able to work in all genres. So I want to talk about this movie's Oscar success. I want to talk about this movie 60 years later, and really my first time experiencing this movie as it was intended to be. So before we get into that, I hope you guys consider subscribing to my channel, but let's jump into The Sound of Music and my preconceived notions of this movie. And let's get some of the obviousness out of the way. I knew a handful of the key songs. In fact, I would say while watching this movie, I was kind of surprised with how many of the songs that I knew. I even like songs that I think if I had thought about it, I could probably say, oh yeah, that is from The Sound of Music. I just kind of was surprised how many they were in this movie. Like 3 hours and you're like, oh yeah, every song in this movie is essentially like really famous. I had a similar experience while watching Spielberg's West Side Story, where I was just like, oh yeah, I've never actually experienced West Side Story until 2021 in any capacity. But yet I just seemingly know most of the music just because it's been in the pop culture 60 years later. And that, like I said, was the same experience with Sound of Music. And I mean, so much of the iconography of this movie is famous. Obviously, the imagery of Julie Andrews in the hills singing the opening song is like a moment that everyone knows, even if they've never seen this movie. Stuff like that lives on, and that's the power of this movie, but it's not the sole power of this movie. This is a movie that I have to admit, my best recollection of this movie wasn't even really watching this movie as a child. Like, I really don't remember watching this movie. It was actually through like osmosis, and specifically it was the osmosis of the Vin Diesel Disney movie, The Pacifier, where there is a very memorable scene involving Vin Diesel thinking that one of the children's is into Nazism because he finds the Nazi patch in the kid's locker, only to find out that he's actually secretly joined the Sound of Music theater play. Like, it's a very funny scene. That was kind of like my introduction in many ways, I think, recently to The Sound of Music. I say recently, like I saw the movie, I think when I was like 8 or 10. But like, that's how I knew Nazis were in The Sound of Music. Like, I don't think that was a plot point that I ever got as a child. I don't know how many children were getting those. But like I said, I did have preconceived notions about The Sound of Music. And I think that review that I just read earlier from Pauline Kael was kind of in many ways how I thought of this movie. Like, it was very sentimental, it was very schmaltzy, it was very like, you know, a very certain type of movie that I never really, I guess, paid attention to. And that makes it me an ass. Like, no way to get around it. Like, I pretend that I'm not into sentimental schmaltz, and then I'll go see a movie like this. I am not one who can resist being emotionally manipulative. When I noticed it, sometimes it bothers me, and I certainly noticed it in The Sound of Music, but it did not bother me at any point watching this movie. And I think I also have this weird aversion to musicals in my head. And then often when I end up seeing them, I'm often quite charmed. I've had that experience. I've been going to a lot more Broadway shows the past 2 years. And I've noticed every time I'm like, do I really want to see a musical? And then usually I leave out and I'm like, I'm pretty charmed by the whole experience. And like I said, I think maybe it was also the fact that this was one of my mom's favorite movies where I just was like, yeah, I kind of know what this movie is. That's, like I said, I'm making an ass out of myself because I was wrong. And this movie has a lot more real world stuff than I remembered. And obviously I think the third act of the movie brings a lot of it too, but I think there is definitely a different perception of watching this movie of being the age of essentially some of the younger kids versus being an adult and kind of seeing what is happening on the sidelines, if you will. The director of this film, Robert Wise, I think wisely located something that we are still discussing today, 60 years, which is the difference between publications who talk about movie reviews, especially on the East Coast, and some of the highbrow mind that goes into reviewing movies like that versus the everyday person. That is a divide that we still see, and it's something that has been kind of plaguing the Oscars over, especially the past 10 years, as some of the Best Picture nominations have gone smaller and smaller, and in many ways less accessible to everyday audiences. And I think Sound of Music is kind of a perfect representation of that phenomenon happening throughout the Academy's history, which is just this divide between critical consensus, specifically some of the East Coast consensus versus the broader appeal. Robert Wise wisely located this in this quote that I found where he essentially talked about how the East Coast intellectual papers gave this movie bad reviews, but then if you look at the local newspapers or you look at the trades within Hollywood, they were all positive. Like I pulled a few quotes. LA Times called it a 3 hours of visual and vocal brilliance. Variety called it warmly pulsating, captivating drama with a brilliant cast. Like that divide is still in there. And I think that's something we still talk about today. And that discourse is important. And I think that's actually a really good way to frame this review that I'm talking about, which is what makes The Sound of Music so wonderful. Like, why was I so captivated by this movie? And how does it have the staying power 60 years later? And I think it does have a lot to do with some of the kindness, some of the brighterness of this movie and its design. But also I think the reason we keep returning to it is, one, besides the way of how it makes us feel, what this movie is actually saying and what it has to say about beauty in a world that is slowly decaying / everything is going wrong. I think this is a movie that definitely deals with a rising wave of fascism coming in and people having to react to that, and also people trying to have a normal life and / have fun in life despite the evilness going on around their borders. I think that is still a theme that really resonated with people. This movie comes out in 1965, right as the United States is entering Vietnam, about a year or so after JFK gets assassinated. Like, the 1960s is such a turbulent period in American history that I believe people were able to find this movie and seek solace in it, where it was just like, hey, as awful as the world can be, there is still beauty. There is still something worth fighting for. And I think that's what The Sound of Music is, because ultimately this movie bends genres. This is a movie that in many ways is comedic, it's romantic, it's a tragedy, it's an adventure movie, and it is also a movie about escape and seeking a better life, which is what the ending of this movie is. And I think that theme resonates with people. And I was really moved by it. I think the third act of this movie is actually my favorite one, which is where everything positive starts to happen. You have this relationship between Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer's character. Like, they meet, they fall in love, like they get married, and then basically on their honeymoon, like they get the call that Austria's been invaded by the Nazis and like they have to go home. And now this whole thing happens where they have to flee their beautiful home that they've formed together. I think that has a resonance with people, and I think it's why people are really charmed by this movie. And I mean, you can't talk about The Sound of Music without talking about what makes this movie so special in its performances. Like, Julie Andrews as Maria is a revelation. Like, this is a reason this is one of the most iconic performances of all time. She is wonderful as Maria. And watching the movie initially, I was a bit skeptical of the performance / the beginning of it, where I'm just like, oh, I get this character. I don't think there's much layers or depth to this character. And as this movie goes on, this character matures. You see this character kind of become a protector. You see this character really take a role in this family's life. And I think it's a really, at times, just like really well captured realization of what a woman must have been feeling like in this situation, being this person that is in isolation, being this person that never feels like they have a home, never feeling like they have a point on this earth, and then to find that here. And of course, there is definitely some societal norms that don't age necessarily well 60 years later. That is obviously something that comes with time. But I also think it's a reason that this movie has been captured by so many people and has meant so much to different communities. This is a very popular movie with LGBTQ community. And I think that is because of this idea of this character of Julie Andrews Maria being this character who is essentially lost, doesn't know her way, doesn't have this connection that she should with the church, like this whole isolation thing. And then she finally, when she has this fighting spirit, this rebellion, this independence within her, like, I think that resonates for a lot of people. So even if some of it doesn't necessarily age well, I still think that broad story is what captures people and like gets them returning to it. I found that really real watching this movie. And like I said, there is a lot of sentimentality in this movie, and I think a lot of it is well deserved. And I think a reason a lot of it's well deserved is the Christopher Plummer performance in this movie, which is probably my favorite performance in this movie. This movie got 10 Oscar nominations, winning picture, director, film editing, score, and sound. The one that it doesn't get nominated, Julie Andrews gets nominated, Peggy Wood gets nominated. The one that does not get nominated, though, is Christopher Plummer. And I think that's a travesty because I believe Captain Von Trapp is carrying so much of the heavy burden of this movie. He is essentially, in many ways, why this movie works to the degree that it works. Like, he has to be the realist. He has to be the one with a big emotional arc through the story. You meet him as this widow who is essentially like kind of just closed himself off from the world. And he's now like having all these questions of how he's feeling. Like you can see that he is not able to process his wife's death. And one of the beautiful moments of this movie, and the reason that he is kind of the secret juice that makes this movie work, is you have to believe his transformation from hard-nosed general person who's kind of just like berating the kids and like making them be so formal and everything, to the moment where he sings the song The Sound of Music with his kids. Like the moment where he hears his kids singing and he joins in and the softness and the wall drops. Like, you have to believe that scene for this movie to work. And Christopher Plummer does such a wonderful job in the scene. And I know this isn't him singing it, but everything that he does as an actor leading up, the moment of him coming in where the song kind of becomes his and it becomes a solo. And then like, as it drops and the children are hugging, like you really feel the journey of this guy facing isolation, the strictness, the anger, and then the remorse in that moment and the love. Like, it is palpable through the scene. It is such a wonderful Christopher Plummer moment and like just such a quintessential moment of him as an actor. It's impossible to ignore while watching this movie. I think he is so magnetic, and I think that is like just kind of the magic of this movie, along with, like I said, this is no discredit to Julie Andrews, who is giving an iconic performance. And I love how she grows more serious as the movie goes, and you believe that because this dual chemistry that these two characters have, it's believable. You see them kind of morphing into each other. You see him getting a little softer and putting his shell down or putting his wall down as she is becoming a little bit more aware of the situation and the seriousness of it as she gains new responsibilities as a parent and as a wife. Like, that's all in this movie. And I think that balance of Christopher Plummer being more of the real character and Julie Andrews being kind of the mystical, magical movie magic, I think it just works to such brilliant effects in this movie. And this movie is able to balance tonal shifts just kind of incredibly. This is a movie that is a comedy at times. It is a tragedy. It is a love story. It is a movie about peril. It is a movie that has to rinse and repeat that throughout this movie. And it does so with ease. It is a movie about happiness to darkness, and it is a movie about normalcy to all of a sudden being in fascism, and how it's not necessarily like creeping, like all of a sudden one day your life can just be changed because of fascism. Like, that is an idea within this movie, within Austria at this time. And obviously there's signs of it coming, but the way that it comes in this movie is really powerful, and I think really resonates with people experiencing political disturbances in any way. And I think that all works. And there's so much other qualities of this movie that work, and I think makes it so nostalgic for people. One of the ones that I noticed is the cinematography / the staging / the lighting in this movie. And from my understanding, a lot of this movie was shot on location, which is why they're able to get the beauty of it. And I think a lot of it is also shot on a soundstage. But the thing that also makes it so incredible for me watching it, and especially someone who's been more of a contemporary film critic for the past 5 years or so, like, I notice it with the digital effects of now. Like, I notice it with the way that cameras look now. And there is something just so beautiful about natural lighting in the 1960s or these earlier films, really pre-digital era, where everything just pops a little bit more. Everything looks a little bit more brighter. Everything just has a natural beauty to it. I would describe it as now, because I'm not someone who understands the science of film, But how I would describe it is films now often look real to the world, which in many ways can make it wonderful. And that is not to diminish any of the cinematography going on, which is wonderful. What this movie is able to do, and I think what movies before this were able to do so well, is this movie almost feels like a painting where it's just like no place in the earth looks as beautiful as when Julie Andrews is just singing in the hills. Like there's nothing that looks that beautiful in this world. And that's kind of the magic of this movie. That's the fantastical elements that keep us returning to it. I have to admit, while watching the movie and hearing the songs, like it's impossible not to get swept away. I have a few personal favorites. It's like hard for me not to talk about The Lonely Goat Herd, which is the yodeling song. Like I love that song. Obviously Sound of Music is iconic. These are a few of my favorite things. Like there's so much. Farewell. Like they're all great songs. I will admit, when I heard the song, these are a few of my favorite things. This is the Gen Z core, the brain core rot or whatever you call it. Like I heard the song and instantly in my head, I just started humming Seven Rings by Ariana Grande. Like that is the brain rot. Like that is really where I am as a 27-year-old man, which is kind of distressing in many ways. But it also, like I said, it shows that that song 60 years later still has an influence and is still impactful to somebody like Ariana Grande. It's the way that this movie lives on through nostalgia, the way that it lives on in the popular culture zeitgeist. And I think in periods/times of ugliness, finding the comfort in the escapism is not a rejection of the real and scary. I think that is sometimes this disconnect that some critics can have, which is a movie doesn't necessarily need to be directly about the real and the now, and it needs to be a bummer for it to be something about something important. And I think that's what this movie is able to achieve. I think it has a lot to say, and it actually has a lot that really resonates with the real world and where we are, but it also has an escapism quality that I think can bring people back in, and people then can discover layers, or the people can then feel something about this movie. And I think that is a very comforting thought. And it's what I found myself really enjoying with The Sound of Music. Yes, this movie has really dark moments in it, but this movie is not inherently dark, but it is able to get that in key moments, especially the third act, which I think is just wonderfully placed by Robert Wise. And it's just such a well-designed story written by Ernest Lemon, six-time Oscar nominee, North by Northwest, Sound of Music, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, just to name a few of his credits. Like I said, it all just kind of works so well together. And I think it's a really magical, wonderful movie that 60 years later, I can say as a 27-year-old man who has been doing this for a few years as a film critic, it warmed my heart. And that's a hard thing sometimes for me to do. And it's sometimes a harder thing to go back and see a movie like this with so much time where it's just like, it doesn't age well. It doesn't have that same magic it had. I've seen so many movies like that where I'm just like, I get it. But like at the same time, like just how movies have modernized, I much prefer it. This is a movie that stands the test of time. It's an important movie. It's a lovely movie. And I can certainly suggest it. I'm sure everyone here has seen in this movie, but I'm happy to give my review on it. And this is something that I want to continue doing on my channel for a specific anniversary for these movies that are up for awards, up for Oscars. I want to go back and review them. I want to talk about them. So I have a few more of these planned throughout the year. So thank you so much for joining me on my Sound of Music review. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Oh, I forgot to give a star rating. Let's go 4.5 out of 5 stars. Like I said, I was genuinely charmed by this movie. Everything about this movie works. Is there anything that I'm missing? I'm just looking at some of my notes on this movie. I don't think so. I think that I hit everything that I want to hit on this movie. But to just say, like, again, as to kind of reiterate it, this is a movie that I think a lot of people are going to find comfort in today. And I don't think there is any reason for people to feel dissuaded to returning to something nostalgia, especially when nostalgia speaks to you and when you find comfort in nostalgia. And nostalgia does not always need to be negative, or it doesn't need to be like, if something's overly sentimental, like that's okay. Like sometimes, especially like when people have anxieties about the now and can see certain things resonating, or seeing people do, I guess, a Roman salute as we call them now, like, geez, like, yeah, it is okay to go back and find this comfort and also see a movie that is also about resisting and fighting bad guys. Like that is essentially what this core is. The Nazis are the bad guys. The Nazis have always been the bad guys, and the Nazis will continue being the bad guys. that's where I'll leave this review on The Sound of Music. Thank you so much for watching this review. Make sure to subscribe to this channel. I'll be having more reviews coming out soon. Thank you so much.